It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce this. I am Professor Julia Black and I'm President of the British Academy. And it's fantastic. Thank you so much to Cardiff for hosting this lecture this evening. It's quite appropriate because the lecture is part of our annual lecture series, but it is the John Rhys Memorial Lecture. And that has been endowed for the Academy for about the last 100 years. And it is specifically for a lecture to be held by the Academy on the theme of Welsh or any other Celtic theme. So it is entirely appropriate that we are having this lecture here today in Cardiff. So again, thank you very much to our hosts for hosting us. And I'd like also to say thank you very much to our chair for this evening, Dr. Dylan Foster Evans. So his own work is in medieval literature and poetry, and he has a very strong interest in the Welsh language, so I can think of nobody better to be chairing our event this evening. So I'm going to leave him now to take over and introduce our wonderful speaker as well. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the evening.
Wel, diolch yn fawr iawn i chi, yr athro Black, a noswaith dda a chroeso cynnes i chi gyd yma heno. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I do have some simple housekeeping points to address. The translation facilities, I think, as you have seen, are all working properly. We'll be using them very shortly. But obviously, let us know if there are any problems. And as you can see as well, if you look behind you, this lecture is also being recorded, not streamed live, but will be available on the British Academy website in the near future. There will always be live captions behind me as well. And please do ensure that your mobiles are switched off or on silent. There are no planned fire alarms for this evening, so if the alarm does sound, or if anything else happens, please leave through the nearest exit. There's one behind me here, or straight out of the back and outside there. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the lecture, and as Stefan said, you're more than welcome to ask in either language, in Welsh or English. Questions in Welsh will be translated simultaneously. And after we're finished, everyone is cordially invited to attend a drinks reception just in the foyer outside here. Felly, Dylan Foster Evans ydw i, a fi yw pennaeth Ysgol y Gymraeg ym Mhrifysgol Caerdydd. Mae'n fraint arbennig i mi ar ran Prifysgol Caerdydd gael eich croesawu chi yma i glywed darlith goffa Sir John Rhys yn cael ei thraddodi heno gan yr athro Thomas Charles Edwards. Roedd Sir John Rhys, fel y bydd llawer ohonoch chi'n gwybod, yn arloeswr y maes astudiaethau Celtaidd, ac ef oedd deiliad cyntaf y Gadair Geltaidd ym Mhrifysgol Rhydychen, hynny rhwng 1877 a 1915. Ac mae'n Lloegr y treuliodd i yrfa academaidd, roedd yn ddylanwad cwbl ffurfiannol ar adrannau Cymraeg Prifysgol Cymru, o ran y ddisgybliaeth academaidd ei hun, a hefyd yn sgil y ffaith fod cynifer o ysgolheigion mwyaf amlwg y Gymraeg wedi astudio wrth ei draed. Ac fe allwn ni restru nifer helaeth o enwa yn hyn o beth, ond ymgyfyngaf a nodi i chi 4 o'r amlycaf, a fi bob un yn athrawon y Gymraeg. John Morris Jones ym Mangor, T.H. Parry Williams, Aberystwyth, Henry Lewis, Abertawe, a W.J. Griffith yma yng Nghaerdydd. Rwan, roedd Sir John Rhys yn un o gymrodi'r gwreiddiol yr Academi Brydeinig adeg ei sefydlu yn 1912. Bu farw Sir John yn 1915 a 9 mlynedd yn ddiweddarach rhoddwyd i'r Academi yr elw o gronfa a sefydlwyd mwyn ei goffau. A penderfyniad yr Academi oedd gwneud hynny drwy gynnal darlith neu bapur neu fonograff ar thema Gymreig neu thema Geltaidd arall. A traddodwyd y ddarlith gyntaf yn ôl yn 1925. Felly, o ystyried y cefndir hwnnw, ni allir meddwl am well siaradwr ar gyfer yr achlysur hwn na'r athro Thomas Charles Edwards, deiliad Cadair Geltaidd Prifysgol Rhydychen rhwng 1997 a 2011. So Professor Thomas Charles Edwards is a former professor of Celtic, fellow librarian and fellow archivist at Jesus College, Oxford. He read history at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, where he also studied for a doctorate after taking the diploma in Celtic Studies under Sir Idris Foster. He then studied in Ireland at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies from 1967 to 69, before returning to Oxford as a junior research fellow and then as a fellow in history at Corpus Christi. And he was appointed Jesus Professor of Celtic in 1997. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a founding fellow of the Learned Society of Wales, and an elected honorary member of the Royal Irish Academy, and he is, of course, a fellow of the British Academy. Professor Thomas Charles Edwards is a leading scholar of the histories and languages of Ireland and Wales in the post-Roman and medieval period, and indeed his ability to bridge the Irish Sea, at least in academic terms, is second to none. His publications are too numerous to list in any great detail, but we may note in particular his monographs on the Welsh laws, 1989, early Irish and Welsh kinship, 93, early Christian Ireland in the year 2000, and Wales and the Britons in 2012. So we are delighted to welcome Professor Thomas Charles Edwards to address us tonight. Thomas, a very warm welcome. Croeso cynnes.
It's a great pleasure to give this lecture in honour of Sir John Rhys, someone who, as Dylan has just told us, was remarkable as a scholar for his range, but I have the distinct impression that he was a very nice man. I get that particularly from his account of his visit to the Isle of Man, which I warmly recommend to you if you haven't read it. I hope everyone has a handout, because I'm so primitive that handouts are my natural method of doing things. In John Contraini's paper, which was given to an International Celtic Congress, the only one that was ever in Oxford, The Irish Contribution to the European Classroom, he wrote, and it's on the handout, that Irish teachers came in sufficient numbers to the continent between the late 8th century and the early 10th to make their presence felt in at least 117 European monasteries, cathedrals, and palaces. And he added that as a foreign presence in a society directed and held together by the Franks, they far outnumbered their Anglo-Saxon, Visigothic, and Lombard colleagues. Earlier, in the late 7th century, the West Saxon Aldhelm wrote to someone he called Herchfrith, welcoming him back to England from northwest Ireland, where he'd been studying. And in the course of this letter, Aldhelm asked the following question. Why, I ask, is Ireland, whither assemble the thronging students by the shipload? The slightly fancy translation reflects the even fancier Latin. Exalted with a sort of ineffable privilege, as if here, in the fertile soil of Britain, teachers who are citizens of Greece and Rome cannot be found. The citizens of Greece and Rome were Theodore of Tarsus, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Hadrian, whom Aldhelm went on to compare, the two of them, with the sun and the moon, while the Irish were compared with the stars of heaven, much more numerous, perhaps, but shedding much less light. The background to Aldhelm's indignant question was given by Bede in his Ecclesiastical History, where he wrote that in the time of the second and third of the Irish bishops of the Northumbrians, sent from Iona, Finan and Colman, namely between 651 and 664, many English nobles and commoners had left their fatherland and had gone to Ireland, whether for study of scripture or for a more ascetic life. In Ireland, the first group, the students of scripture, had visited the homes of teachers, where they were fed and taught, as well as provided with books, all for free. Nor did Bede claim that the movement of students from England to Ireland came to an end in 664. Indeed, he knew it did not. Of Bede's two categories of Englishmen in Ireland, the students of scripture and those interested in ascetic life, Aldhelm was concerned only with the first, the students of scripture, who he thought would have done much better to study with Theodore and Hadrian at Canterbury rather than with Irish teachers. So, Bede, who commended the Irish, and Aldhelm, who did not, agreed then on the numbers. And that makes it very hard to deny that many Englishmen did indeed go to Ireland for the sake of teaching, the teaching that they could find there. The ability to absorb numerous English students in the late 7th century and to provide numerous teachers for the Frankish dominions in the 9th both testify to one thing: a surprisingly ample supply of teachers in and subsequently coming from Ireland. Now, I propose to ask a question related to Aldhelm's, but entirely without his combative purpose. Why was the supply of teachers in early medieval Ireland so ample? And I shall look for an answer in the nature of Irish society in the 7th, 8th, and early 9th centuries, before, that is, it underwent significant change to meet the Viking threat. By the 7th century, Ireland was more extensive territorially than what remained of Celtic Britain. It did not have to contend with warfare directed against it by the English, except in a single year, 684. And that was a dreadful experience. The major churches were more numerous and by this stage, by and large, richer. Moreover, although through the Peregrini, who had gone and were still going from Ireland to Francia and Italy, apart from England, the Irish had already acquired a network of contacts on the continent. All three societies, those of Ireland, Celtic Britain, and the English, were inegalitarian. But Irish society was more so than the others, and this was true for those who lived from a skill or knowledge as much as for the ordinary laity. The division of the clergy into 7 grades, that later became conventional, is likely to have originated in 7th century Ireland. Other professions of skill and knowledge, and even accounts of lay status, tended to follow suit, or at least to try to do so. So, a starting point is to examine such evidence as there is for the education of Irish churchmen. The first clutch of Irish and British saints' lives date to the late 7th and early 8th centuries. But they were preceded by half a century by Jonas's Life of Columbanus, written in 642 about a saint who died in Italy in 615. This life is revealing because Jonas took the trouble to inform himself about Columbanus's early years, and because one stage of the saint's education, I forgot to turn off my thing. One stage of his education was in one province and another in another. Columbanus was a native of Leinster, where in his boyhood and youth he had studied the teachings of liberal letters and grammarians. This must have been preceded by an elementary education in the tools of literacy and numeracy, roughly 3 R's, but that stage was, as usual in saints' lives, taken for granted and not thought worthy of comment. For the final stage of his education, Columbanus left Leinster and went to an outstanding teacher called Humanities, with whom he studied the sacred scriptures. Now, the 3 stages of Columbanus' education reflect the 3 stages of Roman education. First, the elements, then grammar, and then, finally, rhetoric. The content of the 3rd stage, traditionally rhetoric, had been replaced by study of the Bible. And on the other hand, rhetoric seems to have been combined with grammar in the 2nd stage. So Gildas, in the early 6th century, clearly had a rhetorical education. But his close knowledge of Scripture suggests that rhetoric had already been combined with grammar as a 2nd stage to make room for biblical study in the 3rd. Among the teachers exported from Ireland to Carolingian Europe, the teachers of grammar and of scriptural exegesis stood out. At the beginning of his narrative of Patrick's journey round Ireland, Bishop Tirchan wrote these things from the oral statements or from the book of Bishop Ultan, whose fosterling and pupil he was. And on Ludwig Bieler's interpretation, which I think is very likely to be true, Tirchan associated being Ultan's pupil with being his foster son. They were, it seems, 2 aspects of the one relationship. And Tirchan, it may be noted, was a native of the western province of Connacht, but the church of his teacher and foster father, Ultan, was in the East Midlands, in what was then known as Brecha. So just as Columbanus left Leinster to study with Humanities, so Tirchan left Connacht to study with Ultan. Arthur Lawrence's Life of Columba is instructive in a slightly different way. Columba is said to have had 2 teachers when he was already a deacon. One was a priest called Gemman, who lived in Leinster, the other Bishop Finva, probably of Movilla in Ulster. Columba, therefore, like Columbanus and Tirchan, had teachers in different provinces. In his case, he was a native of neither Ulster nor Leinster, So he presumably had his elementary education back in the northwest. So the 3 stages are replicated up to a point in his 3 teachers. But in terms of the 3 stages implied by Jonas in his life of Columbanus, both of the named teachers of Columba were concerned with the 3rd stage, study of the Bible. And that was only to be expected, really, since Columba was already, as I've said, a deacon. In both Ireland and Wales, it was normal for royal children to have more than one set of foster parents. So I turn now to Tirchan's delightful account of St. Patrick instructing Ethne and his sister, daughters of Loeghere, the king of Tara, in the Christian faith. And Ethne asked him about God the Father. Have many fostered his son? For the son of the King of Kings, nothing less than many foster parents or sets of foster parents would be fitting. And the same multiple fosterage of royal children was the custom in Wales at the end of the 12th century, with, according to Gerald of Wales, disastrous consequences. In the first life of St. Samson, probably contemporaneous with Oddofnan's life of Columba and with Tirchan's Collectania, the saint's father, called Ammon, who was a native of Dyfed, was reluctant to send his son to be taught by Istid on the grounds that his kinsmen had always been royal servants and foster fathers of kings. Fosterage, apparently, was something that bound the nobility to the royal family, and for this purpose, a plurality of foster parents made excellent sense. If any foster parents were fostering more than one child, the children were expected to become close allies, which is why the normal Welsh word for friend, cyfaill, earlier cyfaist, literally someone fostered along with another, eventually ends up as being just friend. It is not surprising then that Columba of the royal lineage of Cenel Gonel should have had more than one teacher and foster father. The interweaving of fosterage and education lies behind the development of Welsh athro, in origin foster father, to mean teacher. And the relationship of teacher or foster father to foster child had legal consequences in both Ireland and Wales. According to the Welsh law book Llyfr Cyfnedd, no one had the right to take someone as a surety for a transaction if he were an ysgol haig, attending a school, without the permission of his athro. In Ireland, here using the metaphor of the human body, a head was a surety for his limbs, and the heads and limbs mentioned include a teacher for his pupil, alongside a father for his son, and an abbot for his monk. The Irish law book, Seanachas Mor, which I would date to about 700, and thus within a very few years of Oddofnan's life of Columba and Tirchan's account of Patrick, as well as the life of St. Samson, and indeed Aldhelm's letter to Herchwith, included a tract on fosterage, Coin Eroth. Although it is preserved only in fragments, enough survives to provide vital information. The natural parents made a contract with the foster parents to provide care for the child. Fosterage had an end point determined by the age of the child, so 14 years for a girl and 17 years for a boy. It is not clear from the surviving portions when it was expected to begin. This may, in fact, have varied. Handing over the child to the foster parents was typically accompanied by the natural parents giving the foster parents an earth, usually translated fosterage fee, but literally aftergift. And its name, earth, provided the name of the tract on fosterage, the regulation of the earth. Yet, it was also possible to take a child for fosterage without a fosterage fee. This was termed a fosterage of love, or fosterage for pleasure or delight. And this will turn out to be important when we return to the English students in 7th century Ireland. The argument that I shall now present starts from 3 propositions. The first is that all foster parents had a duty to educate their foster children. The second is that this was true not just of the ordinary lay population, but also of professional groups, learned poets, churchmen, and those possessing Latin learning. This last category, those with Latin learning, I shall call scholars for short. The third proposition is that kings and nobles had an incentive to direct some of their sons towards professions, including that of scholars, in which they could retain high status by a route different from kingship or high nobility. After that, the argument will switch to consider churches as fosterers and what fostering might do for the standing of a particular church. First, then, the legal framework of fosterage as set out in Coin Earth included the duty of foster parents to educate their foster child. And the education varied according to gender, status, and expected future occupation. The details are unfortunately not given in the fragments of the old tract, but in commentary. Still, the broad shape of what was expected is clear enough. The main discussion was in terms of lay status. A boy of free but non-noble status was taught to perform tasks on the farm, appropriate to persons of his age, such as herding animals. A girl was taught domestic skills, how to grind corn, how to use a kneading trough and a sieve, in other words, tools for making bread. A noble boy, on the other hand, was taught to ride, to play the board games characteristically played by nobles, and to swim and to cast a spear. A noble girl was taught the skills in needlework required to make fine clothes. Education, then, was an intrinsic part of fosterage. So much for the ordinary laity, but a fragment of the old tract reveals that a parallel hierarchy for learned poets, the fides, also worked for fosterage. They constituted a largely hereditary profession. On the whole, poets were children of poets. It can very probably be inferred that for them, the early education and training required to initiate someone into a career as a learned poet formed a requirement of fosterage. A poet who had a son would give him to another poet whom he admired for his ability as a foster son. One other thing needs to be added at this point. Although a poet was very often the child of a poet, it was possible to move sideways in the elite, so that a lay noble might send his son to be fostered by a poet, and he would not be handicapped because his father was not a poet, his natural father. One early law tract envisages a natural father choosing a foster father for his son for the sake of a craft or for farming. Craft here includes such professions as that of the poets. Irish society was divided into the farming people and the people with a craft. The hierarchy of learned poets was only one professional hierarchy among others in early Irish society. Others were churchmen and scholars of Latin learning. A decree of an Irish synod of the 7th century treated a bishop, a leading head of a church, and the person it terms a scribe as of equal high status. Scribe, was not, at least primarily, one who copied manuscripts, but a scribe in the New Testament sense, of one who claimed expertise in the Old Testament, especially the law of Moses. The main change was that the early Irish scribe was expert in the whole Bible, both Old and New Testaments. That is to say, he was an expert in the content of the third stage of education. As we have seen, the examples of Columba and Tirchan as pupils and fosterlings of their teachers come from texts more or less contemporaneous with the old tract on fosterage. And they give us reason to accept that boys destined for a career in the church and in Latin learning received their education through fosterage, just like the learned poets. They also suggest that the sideways movement I noted from lay nobility into the church or into the ranks of scholars worked just as it did when they were going into the ranks of poets. Columba, for example, was, we've seen, from the royal kindred of Kenilgonal in the far northwest of Ireland, as were most of the abbots of Iona in the 7th and early 8th centuries. Tirchan belonged to an ecclesiastical branch of the ruling family of northwest Mayo. Two law tracts, both likely to belong to the 8th century, name the grades of scholars. One, called Mearlechter, sort of divisions of status, present a list that tries to distinguish 7 grades on the model of the 7 grades of the church. That the names of the grades do not, for the most part, agree with those in the other list, in a tract called Urrecht Beg, and use some terms more firmly attested for the poets, is evidence that there were no generally accepted names for all the ranks of scholars. The top grade, however, is more widely attested, although even there various terms are used. In Críochgabhrach, a tract on status from the early 8th century, someone called a Sri has the same company as the king and the bishop. And Sri can be translated expert. An expert in working with yew wood was one particular kind of three. But most often, as in this case, it was short for three litere, expert in written learning, where liter, letter, is borrowed from Latin litera. And unless the context shows otherwise, it signifies text in Latin. Other legal texts from Munster, on the other hand, prefer another term, egne. It glosses both sapientia, wisdom, and sapiens, a wise man. And since we've already met three litere, being the counterpart to Latin scriba, this may help us to connect the legal material with the annals, which use both sapiens and scriba. The Shanachos Mar actually has relatively few references to a hierarchy of scholars, but in the original introduction to the law book, it uses yet another term for the highest grade, head of written law. So the vernacular legal terminology for scholars is remarkably varied, especially when compared with the terms used in Latin texts, including the annals, which are restricted to two, the scriba, scribe, and the sapiens, wise man. The third proposition advanced earlier was that kings and the higher nobility had incentive to encourage some of their sons to move sideways into the ranks of scholars, as well as into the ranks of the church more generally, and those of poets. This had two benefits. It lessened competition among the sons to succeed their father as king, and it offered an alternative way in which they could retain high status. Royal dynasties frequently shed cadet lines who were excluded from what was called the Rhys, the royalty or royal people. Without an alternative way of holding on to high rank, these cadet lines descended into the ordinary ranks of mere nobles. The leading scholar, like the bishop and the chief poet, however, had a status equivalent to that of an ordinary king. These occupations offered, as a result, ways to avert the slide in status that was the lot of most. That was one way in which fosterage proved most useful. Depending on the aptitude of the boy, he could be given to a foster father with the appropriate expertise. If, for example, the boy directed towards Latin learning flourished under his foster father's teaching, he would then climb the ranks of scholars and so hope himself to become an acknowledged expert in Latin scholarship and to retain the status of a king. Furthermore, those in a position to secure multiple foster fathers for a child were able to find out by trial and error to which foster father's expertise the child responded best. This is where the duty of foster parents to educate their fosterlings and to do so with an eye to their inherited status and to their future occupation met the needs of the ordinary lay elite. When Bede described the movement of Englishmen to Ireland, he wrote that one group of these migrants went round the cellae of teachers, where cellae would probably means homes or cottages. These cellae might have been attached to a church or monastery, but Bede's language does not suggest that they had to be. In the case of Columba's two named teachers, one, Findvar, was a bishop, and so likely to have had his see in the monastery of Movilla. The other, Gemon, was merely described as living in Leinster. A further aspect of Bede's description, one that seems to have struck him most forcibly, was that the English pupils of these Irish magistri were given their teaching and books free of charge. And this is indeed remarkable, since both the vernacular law tract Corus Belli and the Latin Hibonensis make it absolutely clear that instruction required the payment of a fee. The fee, for example, ensured that a child just handed into a church was treated as a fosterling, not as one merely abandoned by the parents in a church, and if there had been, that child would have been a slave. The likely explanation in the old tract on is in the old tract on fosterage, where it makes it clear that besides the normal arrangement with a fosterage fee, there was a fosterage of love, in which no fee was required. And my suggestion is that in a period when Northumbria was being Christianized through monks from Iona, assisted by monks from elsewhere, the abbot of Iona had arranged, certainly in monasteries attached to Iona, but perhaps more widely, that teaching English students would count as a fosterage of love. Today, of course, UK universities love foreign students because they can charge them much more than the natives. In the 7th century, these things were arranged on a more generous basis. Already, by the end of the 7th century, however, pressures existed, making it more likely that the scholars would be working in a church or monastery, rather than teaching in separate houses. These are revealed most clearly by the Collectio Canonum Hibonensis, the big Irish compilation of canon law. In a book devoted to relations between the church and the lay world, a few chapters concerned fosterage and teaching. And one of them sets out the 3 things required of a church: a monk, possibly more, who has remained there and lived a religious life for many years, a fosterling, instructed in his studies to the highest level, and a penitent who leaves having completed his penitence. Monasteries appear to have had a clear interest in keeping their alumni. A ruling evidently Irish in origin declared if someone has been fostered in a monastery and has been instructed up to the highest level of study and subsequently leaves, unless he returns again, he is to be condemned on a charge of being a deserter and a sinner. It seems that this obligation to remain in the monastery in which one was fostered applied only to the alumnus who had been educated through to the highest level and all in the same monastery. It would not apply then to someone such as Columba or Columbanus, both of whom were fostered and taught by different men living in different provinces. Nor would it apply to the English. Not only are they likely to have completed their first elementary stage of education at home, but Bede notes that they went round the residences of the teachers, suggesting that each had more than one teacher. A reason why a monastery should have desired to retain its alumni is that any church, including monasteries, had a status just as much as did an individual. A church, for example, for some offence, may be made subject to tribute, just as ordinary lay people could be penalised in the same way. And the status of a church was closely related to the status of those who currently, or in the past, have been members of its community. Various offences committed in a church were judged especially grave and requiring a penance of 7 years if bishops have been buried there or are currently present. But if it has not had bishops, but is a minor church, let them do penance for 1.5 years. A church was also, according to a vernacular law tract, greatly magnified, that is, given a higher status by accepting a child for teaching. A church, however, could not accept such a child for teaching if it did not have a teacher who was fully competent to provide the necessary teaching. And this was a further compelling reason for holding on to competent teachers, as well as to an alumnus who had been educated up to the highest level of study. The capacity to educate would remain fragile if a church only had a single teacher who might die or leave and go elsewhere. It is unsurprising then that the Hibonenses devoted a book to teachers. It is full of admirable instruction based on biblical texts, such as the chapter headed that teachers should practice what they teach. But it also reveals connections with terminology found in the annals and elsewhere, such as sapiens and scriba. The Hibonenses also devotes an entire book to the judge, here the ecclesiastical and not the secular judge, and to his judgments. In the beginning of one version of the Hibonenses, an indication is given of who the likely judges were. In all ecclesiastical disputes, 3 persons are to be chosen as judges, of whom the first 2 were a bishop and a scribe. It then continues, let the bishop summon together elders and the scribe. Let the scribe investigate Scripture. And in the previous book on a province, it is said that an undoubted province is one that has 10 major churches, 1 bishop and other lesser ones, 10 judges to whose judgment all the cases arising in the 10 major churches are referred. And if difficult cases arise, they are to be referred to the judgment of all 10 judges. Now, it's not stated directly, but perhaps can be inferred that the 10 judges each belong to one of the 10 major churches of the province. A scribe, then, is one qualified to act as a judge by virtue of his scriptural learning. He was to investigate Scripture. And we can see the appropriate learning in the Hibonensis itself, as we could in such earlier writers as Gildas the Briton and Cummion the Irishman. That a major church should have a judge who would probably be described as a scribe, with the biblical learning required of such a person, helps to explain an aspect of the obits of scribes in the Chronicle of Ireland. When the obits of sapientes begin to be included, they were normally termed simply sapientes without an ascription to a particular church. Just as bishops in the annals were not normally ascribed to a particular church, but rather regarded as having the highest rank in the church, irrespective of where they were resident. So that the sapiens had high rank in his profession, that of the scholar. But when a generation later scribae appear in the annals, they are normally ascribed to a church, or in one exceptional case, namely the Ruvin, who is named in one manuscript as one of the compilers of the Hymnensis. He is described in his obit as scribe of Munster, an entire province. And this makes it likely that such persons would have acted as among the judges of the 10 cities, major churches of an undoubted province. Earlier, we met a contrast between a church where there were bishops, alive or buried in the cemetery, and a minor church, a small church, part of our ecclesia. Now we have a contrast between a civitas, a major church, likely to have a scribe, a scriba, and lesser churches that did not qualify as such civitates. And the Irish civitas had the high rank because of the status of the individuals who belonged to it and the status of the individual members, whether bishop or sapiens, or more particularly scriba, sustained the status of the church. My answer to the question, why were the teachers of 7th and 8th century Ireland, in Aldhelm's vivid metaphor, as numerous as the stars of heaven, begins therefore with the institution of fosterage. All foster children, commoners as well as nobles, girls as well as boys, were entitled to education from their foster parents. This varied according to the future expected role of the child, as well as no doubt what the foster parents were qualified to teach. For those of high rank, multiple fosterage allowed access to different foster parents with different skills and allowed therefore some experimentation to discover the career which would suit best the child. Those children born to kings or the higher nobility that excelled in a particular profession would retain a rank equal to that of their parents. And since not all sons of kings could be kings, there was a strong incentive for those who were capable to turn to a profession and therefore to a foster parent who could educate a child in the knowledge and skills required. Among those professions was that of a scholar. A further element in the full answer was the need for a church aspiring to the standing of a civitas to foster children. No church could retain high rank without the ability to pass on Latin learning through fosterage. No church, therefore, could escape the need to have teachers of Latin learning among its members, and the better their reputation and the higher their professional status, the more they would attract pupils, namely foster children, and the higher the standing they would confer on the church where they taught. The pressures that encouraged professional education were personal, familial, and institutional. They were personal in that in a highly unequal society, professional education offered a way to avoid social decline. Familial in that parents concerned for their children needed to find fosterages suitable for them. Institutional in that churches competed to educate and retain good teachers. Thank you very much.